If your brain is hurting at this point, don't worry, so is mine. Hey folks, Alexander Wynn here, CEO of Edgeworks Entertainment and creator of TerraGenesis. I wanted to make this video to talk about something that a lot of players have asked us about, and that is Biospheres. Biospheres is a special system in TerraGenesis. It's kind of like a difficulty level, except it's a whole different way of playing the game. So whenever you create a new game in TerraGenesis, you can choose whether it's a biomass game, which is the default, or a Biospheres game. Biospheres is a system that I added about a year after TerraGenesis originally came out. And I worked on it for a really long time. In fact, there was a certain amount of mystery back then because there was a gray button that just said coming soon on the main page, and everybody was wondering what is coming soon. And that system turned out to be Biospheres. So the idea behind Biospheres is rather than just having a single number, how much biomass do you have on your planet, you actually build a food web, species by species. And so it's a very complicated system, and to be perfectly honest, I'm not entirely happy with how the UI shows off what all is going on. And we get a lot of questions from our players about how it works. So I wanted to sit down and just go through how the system is designed, what all you can do, and really answer a lot of our player questions. So when you start a planet using biospheres, for the most part, the biosphere will be empty. Most of the planets in TerraGenesis are dead, like Mars. There's no life. There are a few planets that start with an existing biosphere, most notably Earth. So if you start on Earth, there are already going to be a bunch of species there. So if you want to dive into biospheres and really play around and see what I'm talking about, starting a biosphere game on Earth is a good way to start. So when you open up the Biospheres section, there are two columns. One says aquatic and one says terrestrial. And these are the two different tracks of Biospheres. Each of these is an independent system, and the terrestrial is the only one that influences whether your planet turns green, which makes sense, right? The only things that make the land look green are the plants on land. So you can also do the aquatic track, but it doesn't contribute to the dry land habitability of your planet. The whole system of biospheres is based around an idea called support. Support can be described as any way that one species influences another. So the most common way that this happens is food. Deer support wolves because wolves eat deer. But there are a lot of other ways that species interact. For example, bees help support flowers by pollinating them. There are any number of animals that help spread the seeds of plants by eating fruit and that sort of thing. Every species interacts with other species in various ways, and that is represented in Biosphere using support. There are three different kinds of support. There's microbe support, plant support, and animal support. Each of those are generated by the one they're named after. So microbe support is made by microbes and consumed by plants. Plant support is made by plants and consumed by animals. Animal support is made by animals and consumed by other animals. They're represented in-game with three different colors. Microbe support is blue, plant support is green, animal support is red. So when you open up the Biosphere system, at the top of each track, aquatic and terrestrial, you'll see three numbers: blue, green, red. Blue, green, red. Those are the microbe, plant, and animal support numbers being generated by that track. All the aquatic species that you've created are generating this much microbe support, this much plant support, this much animal support. All the terrestrial species you've created are generating this much microbe support, this much plant, this much animal. Within each track, there are different tiers of species. There are 4 tiers on each track. There's microbe, algae or plant, herbivores, and then carnivores. You can think of it a lot like a food pyramid. Each one consumes the one that comes before it. So plants are supported by microbes, which put nitrogen into the soil and all sorts of things. Herbivores obviously eat plants, carnivores eat herbivores. So as each tier generates this support number, it's used to help determine the health of the next tier up. If you don't have enough plants, your herbivores will do really poorly. If you don't have enough herbivores, your carnivores will do really poorly. And again, those are represented by support numbers. So the whole idea of biospheres is to build up enough species to generate enough support so that you can build more species of the next tier up. You can't make plants until you have enough microbes in the soil. You can't make herbivores until you have enough plants. You can't make carnivores until you have enough herbivores. You can think of it like building up a house of cards or a pyramid. You need each layer to be strong enough to support the next. If you start a biosphere game on Earth, you can explore this idea a little bit. Open up the biosphere section and you'll see a bunch of different species on each track, aquatic and terrestrial. And you'll see a bunch of support numbers that are already being generated. You've got a bunch of microbes that are generating microbe support, a bunch of plants that are generating plant support, and so on. Support is the most important number to know when playing biospheres. The other important thing to keep track of is the health of your species. Each species is supposed to generate a certain amount of support. Oftentimes it's 1. So a single plant species might generate 1 plant support. But that number is influenced by the health of that species. If that species is endangered or critically endangered, it's not going to be generating 1 support because there aren't that many of them. On the other hand, if they're wildly overpopulated, it might be generating way more support because there are so many of them in your biosphere. You might have 1 species of rabbit, but if they're breeding like crazy, your wolves will do just fine, at least for a while. So the amount of support that is generated by each species is influenced by its health. Health is a very tricky number to get just right, and this is where the gameplay of biospheres really comes in. Because you've got a bunch of different factors that are influencing each other constantly, and so the whole biosphere system is very fluid, very swingy if you're not careful. So, when you're building new species, the trick is to keep them healthy enough to be generating enough support for the next tier up. The main mechanic of biospheres is creating new species, and for this you need species slots. This is what you get from building facilities. In a biomass game, facilities directly create biomass. You build a few, they'll add green to your planet, eventually it'll be habitable. In biospheres, it's just the beginning. Building a facility might give you 1 or 2 or 3 species slots. That just gives you room to create a species. It doesn't do it automatically. So you then have to go in and create each species manually by picking different genes. The first thing that you'll pick when creating a new species is what track and tier they're in. For example, you might make an aquatic algae species or a terrestrial carnivore. Once you start there, you can pick a phylum, such as mammal, tree, actinobacteria, and then 3 attribute genes. These are things like nocturnal, or cold weather adapted, or large, small, high metabolism, different things that create different effects within your species. And you can think of each species in the real world and in the game as being the intersection of these different genes. So for example, if you want to make a wolf, you might say, I'm going to create a terrestrial mammal, and I'm going to add cold adapted, nocturnal, and social behavior. That's a wolf. You might also say, I want to make a dragon, so I'm going to create a terrestrial reptile, and I'm going to add large, flying, and maybe poisonous. You've got a dragon. You can create any number of species. I think I did the math one time. I think you can create something like 80 million species in the biosphere system by splicing different genes in different combinations. Each gene that you add to a species has different effects, and oftentimes they're not the effects that you necessarily want. For example, if you add cold adapted to a species, say you want to make a penguin species, cold adapted will allow them to thrive when your temperature is a little lower than ideal in TerraGenesis. But it also means that they're not going to do as well if your temperature ends up getting too hot. Penguins are not going to do well if the whole planet turns into the Sahara. So balancing the genes that you want with the effects that you want with their side effects is where a lot of the gameplay of biospheres comes in. You're having to create these different species that will work well together and in the planetary environment that you've created, which you may still be changing. And you can use these species to change that environment. There are genes for oxygenation. For example, you can make algae or trees that put more oxygen out into your atmosphere so you don't have to do it through facilities. They can generate heat, they can generate money or increase population growth. There are any number of effects that can come from these different species in the biosphere. Once you've created a species, it'll show up in the list when you tap on the biosphere hex. If you tap on the species, it will open up what we call the organism table. And this is like a jet cockpit of information. Biosphere is an incredibly complicated system. A real-world biosphere is one of the most complicated systems in the known universe. And so in our game, obviously it's simplified, but it's still very complicated. There is as much calculation or more that goes into a biosphere section of TerraGenesis as the rest of the game. Once you're looking at the organism table, there are a bunch of different sections that you can scroll through that give you different pieces of information. For example, the first section is about tolerances. This will show you how your species is reacting based on the environmental conditions of your planet. If you're playing on Mars, which is dry and cold, and you've created a species that would really love warm, humid environments, it's not going to do very well on Mars. It may not survive at all, or if it does, it may be just barely holding in there. So you can see in this section the temperature, pressure, oxygen, and water requirements of your species, and how well the planet is currently meeting those. Now, it's not necessarily a problem if these numbers aren't perfect. Planet Earth is not particularly well suited for penguins, but penguins are doing okay. They've got a certain area where they live, and they're doing okay. If you create a species that isn't perfectly adapted for your planet, that's fine. Just know that its health is going to get dragged down because of that. The health is a representation of how well your species could do if planetary conditions were better. But just because a single species' health is low doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem that needs to be fixed. At the bottom of the tolerance section, you'll see that all of these scores are averaged together for a tolerance score. Below that are different sections showing off other things that can influence a species' health. For example, how much support are they receiving from the tier below? If you create an herbivore species, and it can survive fine in the environment, but you don't have very many plants, which is to say, not very much plant support being generated by your terrestrial plants, there's nothing to eat, and that's going to drag down the health of your species. You might have a species that could thrive on this planet if there was more to eat. So its tolerance score might be high, but its support received score might be really low, because it's not getting enough support from the tier below it. If that's the case, you need to add more species to the tier below and make sure they're healthy. Having 100 plant species isn't helpful if each one of them is only at 5% health. You don't need to add more plant species, you need to bring up the health of the ones you have. And to do that, you can tap on each one and see what's dragging down their health. Maybe the tolerances aren't right. Maybe they're not receiving enough microbe support. Maybe you received a negative random event that is dragging down the health of a particular species, like there are poachers that are hunting it. All of these values are totaled together in the health section of the organism table. Here you can see each number and how they're being multiplied together to create the projected health for your species. That is, given the current conditions, given the amount of support that they're receiving, given everything that goes into the biosphere section, how healthy is this species likely to be? Your projected health for a species is where they will be if given enough time. But there is also the current health of the species. For example, if you make a new species, if you create wolves on Mars and release them into the wild, maybe they will thrive. Maybe you've terraformed enough of the planet that these wolves are going to do just fine on the surface of Mars. But not yet. You've only made a couple. You need to give them time for their population to grow. So their current health and their projected health might be in two different places. And that current health over time is going to reach the projected health. But that happens at different rates, defined by the birth rate of a species, which is another thing that you can control using genes. A species that moves quickly from current health to projected health is nice if things are going well, but it also means that when things get bad, their health will drop faster as well. Below the health section, the last few sections of the organism table show you the effects that are being generated by this species. For example, and most importantly, how much support is it generating? If you've got a species that should be generating 1 plant support, but it's only at 10% health, it's only going to generate 0.1 plant support, which is a problem if you need more plant support. A good Biospheres player is frequently tapping on each of their species, seeing why their health isn't quite where they want it to be, figuring out how they can get their health up, and executing those to keep their entire biosphere healthy. Once you build up enough species, it can have cascading effects. If you've got a bunch of microbes and a bunch of plants and a bunch of herbivores and a bunch of carnivores, you might realize that the reason your carnivores aren't doing well is because your microbes aren't doing well. Everything is interconnected. Increasing the health of your microbes will increase the amount of microbe support they generate, which increases the health of your plants, which increases the amount of plant support they generate, which increases the health of your herbivores, and so on. And similarly, if you get a negative random event, or if you change the conditions of your planet too rapidly, it could throw your entire biosphere into chaos. There are a ton of different things that go into playing a biosphere game. It's a very complicated system, but at its core, there's a very simple mandate. Increase your support numbers. You've got microbe support, plant support, and animal support. You basically want each one to be as high as possible. In particular, you want your plant support to be high. If you go to the stats summary page, you'll see that the habitability of your planet requires a certain amount of plant support. That's the green number in the little green circle. There's a minimum threshold that you have to hit for your planet to be habitable, and then there's a maximum threshold that you have to hit for your planet to be fully green. So to increase that plant support number, you need to increase the number of plant species that you have, and then you also need to make sure that those plant species are healthy. And to increase their health, you tap on each one, check the health section to see which numbers are dragging down the average, and address them as necessary. That might involve changing the conditions of your planet. It might involve creating more microbe species to support your plant species. It might involve creating entirely new plant species to help flesh out the biosphere. There are a bunch of different ways that you can approach it, and it really encourages player creativity. I've seen some incredible biospheres that were designed by players. They share them on Facebook and Twitter and Reddit. One player a couple of years ago made a biosphere that was entirely based on Lord of the Rings. And they had orcs and trolls and all sorts of stuff. I've seen sci-fi biospheres. People will sometimes make themes, so they'll make an insect planet so that every species is insects, or they'll make a cutesy planet where all the species are small mammals that are really adorable and beautiful. They'll get really creative with the kind of species that they make, because there's so much flexibility in this system, along with the constraints of keeping everything healthy. The last thing that I want to mention is an expert-only feature. So Biospheres is hard enough if you're playing it on normal difficulty, but if you play on expert mode, there's an extra feature. And this feature was originally part of the Biosphere system that I designed, but when I ran it by some beta testers before launching it, overwhelmingly, the one piece of feedback that they came back with was, this part is too hard. Keep this out and the rest of the system is fun. And so what I did was I made it an expert mode only feature, because if you're playing on expert mode, you're looking for a challenge. And that is predation. So in normal difficulty, Biosphere games, each tier only affects the tier above it. Microbes influence plants, plants influence herbivores, herbivores influence carnivores. But on expert mode, it can actually go the other way too. You can add so many wolves that you drive your sheep into extinction. Or you can add so many sheep that you drive your plants into extinction. You can over-predate different species. And so you get a top-down destruction of your biosphere. Not only do you have to keep each layer of the pyramid strong, you have to keep each layer above it small enough that it doesn't get overwhelmed. This adds an extra level of complexity and swinginess to the whole system. And whenever I see a player who successfully terraforms a planet using biospheres on expert mode, it's a really impressive achievement. Predation is listed on the organism table alongside all the different random event effects that can happen, and right next to the conservation slider, which you can use to spend money directly to increase or decrease the health of a species. This represents the efforts of environmentalists and scientists and zookeepers and any number of people who are interested in keeping a species alive even when its natural pressures might not allow it to in the wild. Or alternatively, the efforts of hunters, again conservationists, and people who are interested in getting rid of an invasive species that is doing harm to the biosphere. This is just based on money, so if you've got enough money to throw at the problem, you can drive a species to extinction or artificially boost up its health. Playing on expert mode with the predation system makes the whole thing that much harder, but also that much more complex and interesting, because you can get really unexpected scenarios where introducing a single species into a biosphere can throw the whole thing into chaos. Not just the tiers above it, but the tiers below it too. And this really helps show off what has happened in real biospheres all across Earth throughout human history. Humans are not particularly clean creatures when we come into a new environment. We often like to reshape landscapes as we see fit. And we have introduced any number of really invasive species into biospheres that don't know how to handle them. So playing on expert mode with predation and all these different ways of interconnecting your species helps you explore the idea of what happens when a biosphere or a food web that was stable gets a new species injected into it that has not yet found its niche, and all the chaos that can cause. Since it was first introduced, Biospheres has become one of the most popular systems in TerraGenesis, but it's also one of the most daunting and one of the most feared among certain players. And I really would love it if everybody would check it out. It's really complicated, but it's really fun. It adds a whole new level of gameplay to TerraGenesis, and it adds a level of creativity that doesn't exist anywhere else in the game. It's great for anyone who's interested in biodiversity and ecology. It's also great for anybody who wants to really get granular on creating a new world. If you've got any questions about the Biosphere system that I didn't cover, post them in the comments below. I check the comments all the time. I'm also on the Facebook fan group, the subreddit. I'm on Twitter at AlexForTheWin, and I love talking to the players. I'm happy to answer questions about Biosphere. It's a really complicated system, and even this video didn't go into every single aspect of it. There are more genes and more combinations than I could possibly cover, even if this video was 10 hours long. And if you made it this far, post in the comments below and tell me what you thought of this video. I love hearing from the fans. So tell me what you thought of this video, tell me what you'd like to see in the next one. Let me know if you have any other questions that you'd like me to cover. And in the meantime, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, YouTube, Twitch, anywhere. And we also have a Patreon where you can help support us and get a lot of extra benefits, both in TerraGenesis and elsewhere. TerraGenesis has absolutely changed my life, and that is entirely thanks to people like you. So thank you for watching, thank you for playing, and as always, happy terraforming.